Hey, everybody, welcome back. Hope you're doing well as we start the week together and as we continue through the Gospel of John together. We're in the 16th chapter, the 16th verse today. Jesus continues a discourse he's having with the disciples. I'll read through maybe about verse 24 or so, then we'll come back and talk it through. A little while, and you will no longer see me, and again a little while, and you will see me. Then some of the disciples said to one another, "What does he mean by saying to us, 'A little while you will no longer see me,' and again, 'A little while and you will see me'? And because I'm going to the Father." They said, "What does he mean by this little while? We do not know what he's talking about." Jesus knew this, that they wanted to ask him, and so he said to them, "Are you discussing among yourself what it means that I said, 'A little while and you will no longer see me,' and again, 'A little while and you will see me'? I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn, but the world will rejoice. You will have pain, but your pain will turn into joy. When a woman is in labor, she has pain because her hour has come. But when her child is born, she no longer remembers the anguish because of the joy of having brought a human being into the world. So you have pain now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. On that day, you will ask nothing of me. I tell you the truth. If you ask anything of the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Until now, you have not asked for anything in my name. Ask and you will receive, so that your joy may be complete." Scattered throughout this section, this discourse that Jesus is having, is this deep theme that hangs over it of the cross and the separation. And in some ways, the Gospel of John stands out in giving us this extended conversation with Jesus and the disciples. John almost makes the cross as much about Jesus leaving as the actual event itself. And I would argue, Michael, you could push back on this, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke tend to be cross-focused, but John is so committed to Jesus going to the cross, he almost in some ways looks past it as to what the experience will be like for them. And he seems to highlight that in a particular way. And I think Jesus' words here are very interesting. You know, my favorite line here is the disciples say, "We do not know what he's talking about," which, if you've tried to follow Jesus at some point, I think inevitably we all find Jesus confusing. And here Jesus then, and this is the way Mark or John teaches. We've seen it before. We've mentioned it before, but here the misunderstanding, and Jesus tells you, you're coming into a hard season. This undergirds what he's been saying. You will weep and the world will rejoice. Remember, the faith in the world and the Gospel of John are in conflict. You will have pain, but your pain will turn into joy. And in this, I think, Michael, John encapsulates what is to be the disciples' experience, both those who are written in the story and those who are reading the story at the end of a difficult time with the world, that there will be struggle. Jesus has been saying that consistently, but the promise that on the other side of that, joy will reemerge.
I think that there's a bit of a departure from the text itself here towards a larger overarching interpretive kind of move. So bear with me for just a second here. But I do think it's important to lay the framework for this because not only does I think John frame the cross differently within the story of Jesus, not in any way in opposition to the other gospels, but I think, and you can push back on this, Clint, if I'm going too far, but I think that for John, the glory of Christ is the center of the story, that Jesus is glorified from the very first pages of the book. Jesus doesn't have to pass tests. Jesus doesn't have to undergo turmoil or struggle. Jesus from day one is the glory of God. And so the cross as the center of the story just doesn't land the same in this book, because ultimately John also knows and freely talks about the resurrection of Jesus. And ultimately, John's going to end the story with this incredible relational encounter with the glorified Christ. I think the glory of who Jesus is such an important aspect of portraying Jesus as Savior in this particular gospel, not in opposition to the others, and not in any way devaluing the meaning of the cross, but the cross represents another way in which Jesus's glory can be seen in the midst of his story. And I do think if you are willing to follow me there, then when we come to this story, the idea here that Jesus is going to both be missed by the disciples, that his teaching, his life, the fact that he's going to be leaving them, that this is going to be confusing to them, it naturally follows, right? Because the glory of Christ is such that it is beyond even these initial disciples' ability to understand it. And so you have that reality just at play here, that at the end of the day, the glory of Christ is beyond their ability to comprehend. But then that also plays deeply into the latter part of this text, I think, where Jesus goes into this idea of the pain, the sorrow, the anguish that goes along with losing him and his glory, and all of that. Of course, there will come joy, but I think we as Christians thousands of years later, we might miss the kind of visceral emotional response that the earliest generation of Christians knew in their everyday existence. That the Jesus who died, the Jesus who was glorified in resurrection and ascension, that Jesus wasn't back yet. And there's this expectation he should be back. He should be here. Why isn't he here? And so this sorrow and this anguish, this isn't symbolic or metaphor for the disciples who received this book. This was a part of their faith experience in a visceral, physical way. I think we experience it at certain points in our own lives, maybe moments of grief or moments of great darkness or struggle or doubt, whatever that is. But this was a thing that they could relate to and understand. And so here, Jesus's turn to speak about how there would even come joy, I think, is a really powerful sort of message that reminds us that the glorified Christ is the one crucified, but he's also the one resurrected. He's also the one who ascends. He's also the one who will return. He's also the one who sent that advocate we were just talking about in the last study. So there's a broad sense here that I think John is laying out in Jesus's teaching. And I think if we're attuned to it, there's some deep meaning for us even today in it.
I think there's really beautiful imagery here, this idea of childbirth, that the pain is real, and that the pain that the disciples undergo, and that the pain that everyone who follows Jesus after them, all of whom do so in the physical absence of Jesus, all of whom do so without the bodily Jesus here. We all follow under the need and under the guidance and direction of the Holy Spirit. None of us this side of that conversation get to see Christ physically. And so the pain of that separation is real, and the pain of the struggle, and the pain with the world, and the persecution. And yet it points to a joy that is even greater, a day that there will be clarity, a day that there will be completion and wholeness and fullness, reconciliation. And so I appreciate, this is, I think, a wonderful illustration in that it doesn't deny the struggle of faith while simultaneously upholding the promise of faith. And I think that any realistic approach to faith that can keep those two things in conversation, not denying that pain is real and that struggle hurts, but also not minimizing hope of something better. I think it is difficult in our human life sometimes to keep those two things attached to one another. And I very much appreciate how Jesus, through John's reporting here, is able to do that for the disciples and for those of us who come and read it later.
And there's an amazing turn in the text, and I'm sure you caught it, but it comes here as of late in like verse 23. On that day, you will ask nothing of me. That is an incredible statement in the Gospel of John, because by this point, you know how frequently Jesus is being asked questions. I mean, it just happened at the very beginning of this text. See, these questions of Jesus. At the end, Jesus says, you're not going to have anything to ask. There's not going to be anything that you don't understand. There's not going to be any matter of life or faith that hasn't come together. I think, Clint, the finality of Jesus's teaching here is striking, because what Jesus is saying is at the end of all things will be made clear again. And in fact, this idea, if I tell you, if you ask anything of the Father in my name, he will give it to you. That is so often taken out of context to be, if you ask for the ice cream cone you want today, God's going to give it to you. In the Gospel of John, this is an unbelievably deep spiritual teaching about the revelation of what Jesus is showing us is God's intention and will for the entire cosmos, for the world, for everything as we know it, and all of the things that we don't know, that it's going to be clear, that we will see in that day everything as it is, because of the grace of Jesus Christ, because all things will be made right, because in the end, everything will be redeemed in the largest sense, to use the faith word in that. I think this is an amazing gift to us, because theologians often talk about the kingdom of God as being that thing that is already and the thing that's not yet. And I think what this combines in a powerful way is the reality of our already, which is grieving and anguished and painful and difficult, and the not yet, which is the we understand, and anything that we ask is given, and that in the presence of God, we suddenly see it all as it actually is. There is no more need for question, because the answer is finally given. That's the kind of hope and promise that Jesus is offering here. And I do think that Christians who let either one of those two realities collapse, they're missing part of the good news. They're missing the good news for our current moment, and the good news that our current moment does not define God's recreative ability, that the glory of Christ is much greater than what we can see right now. And that is a thing that we can put our hope in, and that a thing can carry us through even when the present time may be difficult time.
We've joked about it, Michael. I think or if people join us regularly, they'll know that you probably have a little more affinity for the Gospel of John than I do.
Yep.
And I think I don't think of John as a text or a part of the New Testament that rings the joy bell a lot.
Right.
I think there might be other places, the book of Philippians, for instance, even Romans. I think there might be other places where you would center your search for joy. But I appreciate here that John not only uses it, that, your anguish will become joy.
Mhm.
That not only does John include a note of joy here, but he does so contrasting it with some of the depth of our struggle and our experience of pain and suffering or of persecution. And this is a deep, I think scripturally speaking, those are the deepest words of joy, not the kind of joy that is immune from struggle, but the kind of joy that lives within it and in spite of it. And there's a beautiful phrase here near the end: no one will be able to take your joy from you. I will see you again, your hearts will rejoice, and no one will be able to take your joy from you. That idea of joy being ultimately the permanent state of being for believers, and our attempt to try and live into that in the here and now as much as we can, to pursue rejoicing. Again, not a rejoicing that says everything has to be perfect and then I can have joy. A kind of rejoicing that says, in spite of the struggles of my life and the world around me, I find joy in Jesus Christ, and nothing can take that from me. That's a beautiful proclamation. It's a powerful word. And I think John, again, it gives us a great testimony in that regard here.
And the
It's really good.
promise of responsiveness is really unbelievable. The idea, if you ask, he will give it to you. And until now, you've not asked for anything in my name. Ask and you'll receive, so that your joy may be complete. That idea of complete joy is unbelievable. Can you imagine joy that is so full as to be described as being complete? And the idea, the way that we find that joy is not by collecting another thing, getting another pay raise, living in a better house, taking a better job, not by having a more picture perfect family. No, whatever we might strive for, that we think, whether we've decided this consciously or subconsciously, that that thing will complete our joy. Jesus here, he shows the way, right? He reveals the truth that ultimately the only way that we receive is by asking. It's not by acquiring or action or agency. It's rather by the invitation, the opening of self, the approaching of God, and that in that surrendering of self and coming to God and asking simply, then we are given the promise that we will receive that joy that is so full as to be complete. And I think you're right, Clint, that the Gospel of John is so interested in providing for us the basis of our belief. We don't get these moments in which we have teachings that are so open and honest about the human response with joy, with freedom, with love. I mean, Jesus talks a lot about love, but there's a lot of commitment and action underneath it. Here, the idea, this is just simple, beautiful, though deep and unbelievably meaningful, but it's not a complicated idea that when we come to God and God responds to us, we discover joy. I mean, that's an amazing gift that Jesus promises in the teaching. Just mind you, it starts with pain, suffering, and anguish, and it's going to move on. And we're going to talk more and more about the loss of Jesus and Jesus being gone. This is embedded inside difficulty. So don't misread this to think that it's some kind of pie in the sky, everything's perfect. No, this is joy that lasts even in the most difficult place of God forsakenness or the loss of Jesus. There's hope even in those places.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about love in this gospel. Now we get to hear something about joy. Tomorrow, the theme will be peace. And so, as Jesus expresses these foundational ideas of the faith, and not to be full on word nerd here, Michael, but I believe, if I remember my Greek a little, which is a question mark, but the word complete here, it is not just about an amount, as in the full amount, but it has the idea of finished. Your joy will be finished. What Jesus is saying, right? That there'll be nothing left to add to it. It will be enough. It will be all you need. It will be finished, complete in that sense of done and permanent. And again, what a beautiful promise for all of us.
And this will be where we conclude here today. It's just to say at the end, note the very, very strange ground that joy travels through. And I think that what Jesus does with his disciples is he names openly and clearly, though they clearly don't understand it, he says to them, there is going to be anguish and suffering, but that suffering produces something, like the woman who, after she holds her baby, she can see the joy of a human being coming into the world. In the same way, there will come a day where the believer will understand that all of these things that have been real and difficult and painful lead us into a new season, a new chapter in which something new has been born. And that thing, Jesus says, might be the fulfilled completeness of joy. And that's, as much as it is a hopeful promise, it is also Jesus teaching what it looks like when we who see in part what it will be like when we see in full. And I think that's a great gift in the gospel.
Yeah, it's a wonderful challenge. I wish, hope, and pray that Christians would be more often identified for their joy than for all of the other reasons we sometimes get identified. If we were all better at being joy-filled Christians, Christianity would probably be better off.
That is not only well said, it would be very well advised for us to try to do.
Yeah.
Sincerely grateful for you to join us. I hope you would like this video if it's been encouraging, challenging to you. Helps other people study it, find it in their own study, and it actually helps way more than you might think. And do subscribe so you can stick with us on studies like this. If you made it this far, we're glad to have you with us and look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.